We've been here doing this for 14 years.
The last 5 felt like 20.
Dwayne Castellano stood in that courtroom on a gray October morning, still wearing the same confident smirk his fans had watched for a decade on television. But as the judge began to read the verdict, something in his posture changed. His shoulders dropped. The man who had built an empire out of rusted-out muscle cars and million-dollar auction hammers gripped the edge of the defense table like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Cameras clicked from the gallery. Reporters leaned forward, and the man they used to call the Chrome King was led out of that room in handcuffs, his eyes fixed on the floor. It turned out the empire he'd built on television screens across the country had a second set of books nobody was ever supposed to see. And the truth behind it was ugly enough to end a legend in real time. But how did Dwayne Castellano go from the most trusted face in the classic car business to the most wanted man in it? To understand the fall, you have to go back to where it all started. A dusty warehouse on the edge of a mid-sized southern city, and a man who saw gold in other people's junk. The summer heat was already brutal when Dwayne Castellano first walked into a condemned tire warehouse on the industrial side of town, stepping over broken glass and rusted-out car frames like he was walking through a museum. He wasn't looking at junk. He was looking at inventory. This was the beginning of what would eventually become Redline Motor Company, the garage that would make him a household name. If you ever caught an episode of Torque and Trouble, the reality show that turned Dwayne into a star, you remember the formula. He'd lean over an engine bay in a faded flannel, phone wedged against his shoulder, closing a six-figure deal while his crew scrambled behind him to finish a build before a deadline that always seemed impossibly tight. It was stage chaos, but it worked. Audiences loved watching a nobody garage in flyover country turn rust buckets into auction block miracles, set to a soundtrack of classic rock and roaring V8s. Dwayne had been flipping cars long before any camera crew showed up. Born in the late 1970s to a family of mechanics, he grew up with grease under his fingernails and a habit of buying broken-down classics for pennies on the dollar, fixing them just enough to flip for a profit. By the time producers found him, he claimed to have moved thousands of vehicles through informal deals, swap meets, and word of mouth. That hustle became the foundation for a business empire that eventually included the garage, a roadside diner, a whiskey label with his face on the bottle, and a concert venue that hosted local bands on weekends. Torque and Trouble premiered and immediately found an audience hungry for a specific kind of spectacle. Real risk, real money, and a swaggering lead character who seemed untouchable. For 9 seasons, the show pulled in millions of viewers who tuned in to watch Dwayne shake hands, chomp on cigars, and peel out of the shop in something loud enough to rattle windows 3 blocks away. At its peak, it was one of the network's highest-rated original programs, turning Dwayne into a celebrity recognized well outside the world of car enthusiasts. He played the part flawlessly. Loud button-up shirts, aviator sunglasses pushed up on his forehead, a signature move of slapping the hood of a finished build before it rolled onto the auction stage. He called himself the Chrome King, and the nickname stuck because for a long time it seemed true. Redline Motor Company expanded into new markets. His social media filled up with private jet selfies and cheering crowds at car shows across the country. Spin-off merchandise carrying the Redline name showed up in gas stations and truck stops nationwide. Hats, koozies, energy drinks. He partnered with a major domestic automaker for a limited edition truck package and became a regular fixture at industry trade shows, the undisputed face of a new generation of car flippers who mix mechanical skill with entertainment instincts. The message underneath all of it was simple and seductive. Work hard, hustle harder, and you too could live like this. It was the classic American self-made story, retold with horsepower. Underneath the surface, though, his crew worked brutal, unglamorous hours that the show conveniently left on the cutting room floor. All-night thrashes to hit filming deadlines, corners cut on part sourcing, arguments over pay that never made it to air. The version of Dwayne Castellano that audiences saw was a character. The version his employees knew was more complicated. But for years, nobody outside the shop asked too many questions. The ratings were too good, the merchandise sold too well, and the mythology was too satisfying to interrupt. Even after Torque and Trouble wrapped its final season, Dwayne kept the brand alive with a YouTube channel, one-off restoration specials, and appearances at car shows where fans lined up for photos. The energy wasn't quite what it had been during the show's peak, but the Chrome King persona endured. He was still flipping, still talking big, still selling the dream. What nobody realized yet was that the protective glow of a hit television show, the thing that had kept scrutiny at arm's length for the better part of a decade, was starting to fade. And without it, people were finally free to ask the questions that had been circling quietly in car forums and industry group chats for years. How many of those triumphant on-camera barn-find restorations were actually what they claimed to be? How solid were the builds once the studio lights went dark? And where exactly was all the money really coming from? The unraveling started with something almost boring, a routine tax audit. In the spring, an investigator with the Internal Revenue Service opened a case file with Dwayne Castellano's name on it, expecting the kind of review that gets filed away after a few weeks of paperwork. High-profile entrepreneurs get audited. It happens. Most of the time, it's uneventful. This one wasn't. The numbers didn't line up with the lifestyle. An expense line for restoration parts and materials was suspiciously clean for a business that supposedly handled hundreds of chaotic, deadline-driven builds a year. And buried in the paperwork for a car that had once been the centerpiece of a Torque and Trouble season finale, a hand-built 1969 fastback Restomod that sold at a televised auction for well over 6 figures. The vehicle identification number looked wrong. At first, the investigator assumed it was a clerical mistake, a transposed digit, a typo carried over from an old title transfer. But when she ran the VIN against the Federal Vehicle Database, the record didn't just look wrong. It came back as non-existent. There was no manufacturing record, no factory build sheet. As far as the system was concerned, the car had never been made. That fastback wasn't some forgotten inventory item, either. It had been the emotional centerpiece of one of the show's most watched episodes, a dramatic, will they make the deadline storyline that ended with Dwayne driving it up a ramp in front of a cheering studio crowd. Fans remembered the scene. Clips of it had circulated online for years. And now, according to federal records, the car underneath all that drama technically did not exist. The investigator brought in colleagues from the Department of Transportation and state vehicle registration offices to cross-check Dwayne's transaction history. The deeper they dug, the more inconsistencies surfaced. Vehicles that should have required emissions, testing, and standard registration fees were missing those records entirely. Parts purchases filed as business deductions had no matching receipts from any of the suppliers whose names appeared on the invoices. Something was badly out of alignment between what the show depicted and what the paper trail actually showed. One clip, pulled from an old behind-the-scenes bonus segment on the show's streaming platform, became a turning point. It showed the fastback sitting under bright shop lights during final detailing, Dwayne joking with his crew as they polished the paint before its big reveal. When investigators slowed the footage down frame by frame, they could make out the partially visible VIN plate riveted near the windshield. It didn't match anything on file with the state's title records. A deeper forensic review suggested the car had actually started life as a salvage title shell, a wrecked donor vehicle purchased cheaply at auction, rebuilt from the ground up, and then retitled under fabricated documentation that skipped inspections a legitimate high-value restoration would have required. The showpiece car, the one fans had cheered for on national television, had a manufactured identity. That single fastback became the loose thread. Once federal investigators started pulling on it, an entire fabric of financial irregularities began to unspool. The IRS quietly opened a broader investigation into possible tax fraud connected to Redline Holdings, the umbrella company behind the garage, the merchandise line, and Dwayne's various licensing deals. Investigators zeroed in on undeclared income from international appearances and overseas vehicle sales, transactions that seemed to route through private collectors and international auction houses without the customs paperwork such sales legally required. For years, Dwayne had publicly bragged about flipping hundreds of vehicles annually. The audit revealed a much messier reality: gaps in documentation, transactions with no paper trail at all, and a pattern that looked less like sloppy bookkeeping and more like a system built specifically to hide something. Behind closed doors, a small team of investigators began reconstructing years of sales, transfers, and public appearances, cross-referencing show footage, YouTube uploads, and social media posts against actual invoices submitted to tax authorities. What had begun as a routine review of one man's tax filings had quietly become a full federal investigation, complete with subpoenas, interviews with former buyers, and a growing case file that Dwayne almost certainly assumed would never see daylight. What investigators eventually found wasn't captured on any of Dwayne's own cameras. It was hidden behind a space his crew referred to, almost as a joke, as the vault. To casual visitors touring Redline's Dallas area facility, it looked like an unremarkable overflow storage room, stacked with old body panels, bins of spare carburetors, and shelving labeled in faded marker. But behind a reinforced wall panel disguised as part of the shop structure, federal agents found something else entirely, a small, professional-grade fabrication setup built for one purpose: manufacturing fake vehicle identities. Agents entered with a search warrant on an overcast morning, working their way past racks of spare wheels and stacked crates until they reached a heavy door secured with a keypad lock. Inside, they found precision engraving equipment capable of stamping convincing replica VIN plates, blank registration stock, and printers sophisticated enough to produce inspection stickers that could pass a casual glance from a buyer or even a low-level inspector. On a workbench along the back wall sat folders of salvage titles pulled from wrecked vehicles purchased at auction, along with handwritten ledgers cross-referencing which salvage identity would be assigned to which restoration build. This wasn't restoration work. It was identity laundering for cars. Vehicles with troubled histories, flood damage shells, frames from total loss wrecks, even a handful the investigation later suggested had questionable ownership histories, were being reborn inside that back room with clean paper identities, then marketed publicly as rare, numbers-matching classics. Buyers who trusted the Redline name had no reason to suspect the documentation in front of them was manufactured rather than authentic. The scale of it stunned even veteran investigators. Some fabricated VINs appeared to have been assigned, reassigned, and shuffled through paperwork across 3 or 4 different states before the vehicle finally landed back at the shop under a fresh identity, ready for a public sale that traded heavily on the Redline brand's reputation. What made the discovery even more damning were the accounts that started coming in from former employees, several of whom had stayed quiet for years, telling themselves what happened in the back room was simply how the business worked. One former technician described being instructed to grind off an old identification stamp and let a freshly engraved plate do the talking, framed to him at the time as a normal part of high-end restoration work rather than anything illegal. Another recalled large, undocumented cash payments changing hands after hours when private collectors picked up specific vehicles, with no invoice or paperwork ever generated. Ironically, some of the clearest evidence came from Dwayne's own content. In one YouTube upload meant as a late-night, behind-the-scenes teaser, he walked the camera past a reinforced door in the shop, joking about projects we can't show you yet. At the time, fans assumed it was a tease for an upcoming build reveal. Investigators recognized the same distinctive hinges and keypad entry system that whistleblowers had already described in sworn statements. Reports compiled during the investigation later estimated that more than 50 vehicles had passed through this hidden identity laundering system over roughly 2 years, with proceeds estimated in the millions. The builds that appeared on camera generally had legitimate paperwork. It was the off-camera transactions, quietly funneled through the hidden operation, that generated undeclared income and let the whole scheme run in plain sight for years without drawing scrutiny. This is what eventually brought federal prosecutors into the case in a serious way. Not a single mislabeled Mustang, but an organized, sustained operation that turned Redline Motor Company's public reputation into cover for a private criminal enterprise. The final break in the case came from someone who had every reason to trust Dwayne Castellano completely. A European collector who had spent years chasing a specific, ultra-rare fastback he'd watched Dwayne restore on camera during one of the show's most celebrated seasons. Dwayne himself had walked him through the car during a private visit to the shop, pointing out the fresh paint, the correct-for-year engine components, and telling stories about the car's supposed factory history. It was a handshake deal sealed with a photo for social media, and the collector wired over $1 million to secure what he believed was a genuine piece of automotive history. What he actually bought was a fabrication. The VIN was manufactured. The supporting documentation was forged. And the vehicle's real, much less glamorous origin, a salvage title rebuild, was buried under a fresh coat of paint and years of marketing built around a story that was never true. When the collector tried to formally register the car overseas, customs officials flagged inconsistencies in the documentation almost immediately, triggering an international inquiry that eventually connected back to Dwayne's federal case. That one buyer's frustration and persistence turned him from a victim into a key witness. He handed investigators years of email correspondence, wire transfer receipts, and even voicemail messages from Dwayne discussing the car's supposed provenance. Documentation that gave prosecutors the final pieces they needed to move from a broad financial investigation to actual criminal charges. Looking back, it's clear the television show itself functioned as more than entertainment. It was the perfect cover for the entire operation. Torque and Trouble wasn't just documenting a business. It was manufacturing trust at scale, one dramatic reveal at a time. Every episode built the same emotional arc, a desperate hunt for a rare find, an impossible deadline, and a triumphant unveiling that made viewers feel like they'd witnessed something authentic and earned. That formula worked because it felt real, and that feeling of authenticity was exactly what let the fabricated paperwork hide in plain sight for years. When Dwayne stood in front of a finished build talking about heritage and craftsmanship, viewers had no reason to question whether the VIN stamped into the frame told the truth. Each triumphant episode functioned, whether anyone intended it that way or not, as an advertisement for vehicles whose real histories were sometimes very different from what appeared on screen. The show's massive audience also created constant demand, and that demand gave Dwayne cover to move an increasing volume of vehicles through the business, without individual transactions drawing much scrutiny. Success bred more success, and more success meant more transactions, more paperwork, and eventually more opportunities for that paperwork to fall apart under close examination. For more than a decade, Redline Motor Company had been a fixture of American car culture, a brand built on hot shop lights, roaring engines, and Dwayne Castellano's larger-than-life personality. It took less than a week for the entire thing to come apart in public. It started with a single post in a classic car collectors forum. Someone had noticed that the receipts for a supposedly numbers-matching Shelby-style build didn't line up with its supposed restoration timeline. Within hours, other collectors were pulling old episode footage, freeze-framing shots of chassis stamps, and comparing them against public auction records. What had once been passive fan appreciation turned overnight into a crowdsourced forensic audit, with hundreds of people combing through years of archived content looking for inconsistencies. By the next afternoon, industry partners who had spent years chasing collaborations with Redline began quietly pulling out of pending deals. Several major auction houses flagged vehicles with any documented connection to the garage, pending further review. The streaming platform that still hosted the show's back catalog pulled promotional banners within 24 hours and issued a brief statement describing an internal review of its content partnerships. Sponsors who had built marketing campaigns around Dwayne's brash, hard-charging persona began scrubbing his image from their websites and social accounts. In the collector car market, prices on any vehicle with a documented Redline history dropped almost overnight. Owners who had purchased cars from the garage over the years started reaching out to each other, comparing notes, checking hidden stamp numbers against public records, discovering in some cases that their prized investment vehicles carried fabricated identities. Some found liens attached to cars they believed they owned free and clear. The ripple effect moved through the broader classic car community as people scrambled to verify what they actually owned.